Hi, Shinzen.
Bob,
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good. I want to talk about how great you're doing in a minute. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Hits TV. You are Shinzen Young, a meditation teacher who has studied intensively in several Buddhist traditions. In fact, I think you were actually ordained as a monk in Japan years ago. Is that right?
That's correct. In the Shingon tradition, which is the Japanese version of Vajrayana, which is related to Tibetan practices.
Okay. And you've also studied Zen and Vipassana.
That's correct.
Which is the tradition I'm most familiar with. I've done some retreats at Vipassana centers. And we want to eventually get back to this subject about how well you're doing, because, of course, the reason you meditate is to get some sort of sense of well-being, I guess, among other things that we'll talk about. I want to say at the outset that one thing I find interesting about you is how explicitly you are trying to fuse Eastern and Western traditions. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of kind of implicit or not necessarily intended fusion of Eastern and Western traditions, because at any of these retreat centers in America, you know, the Dharma talks that the teachers give are inevitably influenced by the fact that they're in America talking to an American audience, and they're addressing the concerns of an American audience and so on. But you set out some time ago, I think, to very self-consciously, draw on kind of Western traditions of analysis and thought, particularly those associated with science, maybe, take those tools and meld them with the meditative tradition. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. I explicitly do that. That's sort of my life passion, to explore what could be born in the interface of those two worlds.
Okay. Now, and I want to talk about that at some length. Before we do that, I'd like to back up and just ask you, why should people pay attention to what we're about to talk about? What can people who are not now meditating hope to get out of it?
So basically you're saying, why should someone, quote, meditate?
Right.
What would be the purpose?
Right.
So I think the first thing that pops into my head when I get asked that question is to clarify what we mean by the word meditation. That's why I said, quote, meditate, because meditation can mean different things to different people. There's a wide spectrum of activities that come under the name meditation. So I think it's very important, before we start to address the question of why meditate, to at least spend a little time addressing the question of, well, what do we mean by meditation? The word. So what pops into the head of most people when they hear the M word, in this case M meaning meditation, is they get the image of someone sitting probably on the floor, semi-darkened room, maybe in some posture, and maybe there's some incense or some bells or something like that. Maybe they're making an Om sound, possibly. The image that we get in general when we hear the M word is the one I just said. Someone probably with their eyes closed, seemingly turned inward, seemingly trying to cool out, mellow out, or in some way get involved in their own subjective world, cutting off the objective world. This would be your common archetype or image of meditation.
And I get the feeling you're about to tell us it's not entirely accurate.
That's not, well, I would say that's a facet of meditation. But I would say that's not the image that pops into my mind when I now hear the word meditation. Although absolutely it would have been the image that popped into my mind before I got involved in meditation. And indeed, even in the early years of my practice, this is what I was primarily into. It's like, let's be able to sit in the full lotus for 2 hours and cool out, mellow out. That's where I started. That wasn't. So that was my image also. But that image has radically changed over the years. So now, when I think of meditation, the image that I get is someone doing a workout in a gym. They're pumping iron, they're jogging, they're doing aerobics, they're doing formal exercises that with time make changes in the fabric of the body. You do certain kind of exercise and it will increase your flexibility. You do other kinds of exercises, they'll increase your endurance, your strength, and so forth. Now, when you do an exercise, you're not just strong or flexible while you're doing the exercise. The exercise has a permanent effect. Well, I guess we'd say quasi-permanent effect.
An enduring effect.
Yes, a lasting effect on your body, so that you're strong in daily life, or you have endurance in daily life, as you're just going around in the world, as the result of having allocated on a regular basis short periods of time to do these sort of artificial exercises. Nature does the rest. You do the exercise, and it's in the nature of the body to change in positive ways.
So you get better at confronting aspects of actual real life outside of the meditative practice. Is that right?
That would be the general thing.
And what are some examples of things you'd handle better, or ways you'd see things differently, or?
Yes. So if you wanted to sort of say, in general, why do people meditate? It's that the meditation is a formal exercise that develops certain characteristics in consciousness. And as the result of those characteristics being present in your consciousness, in daily life, there are effects, and those are the effects that you're asking to have listed. So I would list 5 major effects if the meditation sort of delivers the goods. Now remember, there are many, many kinds of meditation. And different kinds of meditation will work better for different people. Also, even for the same person, at a different time in their psycho-spiritual itinerary, a different form of practice may be more appropriate for them. So it's a matter of getting a match between the type of meditation and who you are at a given time. So assuming that the meditation, quote, works and delivers the goods, I would say, broadly speaking, there are 5 areas of positive impact. One would be a decrease in perceived suffering.
I like that idea.
Yeah.
I'm with you so far.
Both physical and emotional, I should say. So physical distress and emotional distress, they're part of life. There's no way that we can live this life without experiencing physical discomfort and without experiencing situations that cause us to have emotional discomfort. It's part of life, and there's no way to avoid it. And in fact, we shouldn't avoid it. It's part of the richness of being a human being. However, physical discomfort and emotional discomfort is distinct from suffering. Suffering is pain as a problem. And it turns out that when meditation works, it gives you a skill set that allows you to experience physical and emotional discomfort with greater poignancy, but less problem.
So by greater poignancy, you almost mean you actually perceive it more acutely in a sense, but it causes you less trouble? What do you mean by...
That's exactly what I mean.
Okay.
So you learn how to escape into discomfort There's two ways to deal with discomfort. Escape from it. If you can, great. But what if you can't? Well, if you can't, it's good to have in your quiver of life arrows, so to speak, the ability to escape into it. Then you sort of have your cake and eat it too. You experience the richness of being human, and part of that is uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But the sense of problem, the sense of suffering is diminished. Mm-hmm. So now how that takes place, well, that's at least an hour talk.
It is, although can I interrupt you and just mention one little kind of exercise I've suggested to people as a shortcut to getting the idea that I think sometimes actually works. What I've said is when you're feeling really sad, and these are people who haven't necessarily meditated at all, when you're just feeling sad, on the border of depressed, sit down, close your eyes, and just try to accept it, and just say, bring it on. What does sadness feel like? Pay attention to it. Just accept it. Just close your eyes and examine the feeling of sadness. Get closer to it. And some of them do report, although they haven't meditated, that oddly they do sense some of the kind of diminishing of the suffering. And you know what I mean?
Well, I totally.
Of course you do.
However, I would just slightly disagree and say those people, in fact, have meditated.
Okay.
You just gave them the essence of meditation.
Right.
Remember, you don't have to have your eyes closed and be sitting on the floor. What did you have them do? You had them focus on the discomfort. You had them try to be precise about the discomfort. And you had them try to not fight with the discomfort. Those, in that very short sentence that you said, you mentioned implicitly the three core skills that I like to teach as meditation. The three core skills are concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity. You just described, you focus on it, that's your concentration power. You try to be very precise about it, that's your sensory clarity. You try to train those circuits not to fight with themselves. That's a quality that we technically call equanimity. Those three skills working together constitute something that in my tradition is called mindful awareness. So you just gave a beautiful, very short description. Anyone that did that has done mindfulness practice, even if they only did it for 2 minutes.
Okay. So that's
effect number one.
Reduce suffering is effect number one.
Yes, and that's both physical and emotional. Okay. So how do you suffer emotionally? Well, shall I count the ways? Anger, fear, sadness, embarrassment, impatience, disgust. Those don't have to cause suffering, even if the anger is rage and the fear is terror and the sadness is deep grief. That can still be experienced so fully that it's so present that, in a sense, it's no longer present. Oxymoronic, sort of self-contradictory, though that way of talking may seem. So reduce suffering, and that's not just emotional. How about all the physical stuff? From mild irritations of discomfort, it's a little too hot, it's a little too cold, I'm a little sleepy, to the horrific things of injury and illness. Mm-hmm. Same deal, same principles. Well, that's the beauty of it. One size fits all. That same core skill set, when applied to physical discomforts, reduces suffering. So effect number two is sort of the flip of that. The same skill set that can allow you to experience physical and emotional pain with reduced problem will allow you to experience physical and emotional pleasure with elevated fulfillment. Same skill set, exactly. So if it only delivered freedom from physical suffering, it would already be worth the price of admission. But it actually delivers freedom from physical and emotional suffering and it deepens our sense of fulfillment with pleasure. So people in general don't realize that the degree to which we're fulfilled with the pleasure is a function of two variables: how intense the pleasure is and how mindfully we can experience the pleasure. So that's effect number 2. Effect number 3...
Can I just interrupt and say, there's a little bit of an irony there, or what would strike people as ironic. I think, when some people think of Buddhist practice, they think of a greater degree of detachment in general from feelings. And there's something to that description, whether you want to use the word detachment, there's something to that. There is a kind of critical distance you're acquiring in a certain sense from certain of your feelings, at least. So anyway, the assumption often is, so you're going to kind of be less involved in both negative and positive feelings. And in a way, what Buddhism is just choosing to, instead of having a roller coaster life with lots of lows but lots of highs, just be on kind of an even keel. And sure, it reduces the most extreme sorrows, but it also reduces the greatest pleasures, right? I mean, that's a common sense view, or a common view, I would say, of what the Buddhist choice is. And I'm still a little unclear on why that isn't the effect. I mean, I myself have been at meditation retreats, and I've experienced the fact that there is a kind of a deeper joy and appreciation of life, but I don't understand why that is exactly. It seems to me that the common view of Buddhism, that it's more of an across-the-board detachment, that's kind of what I would almost expect to result from it. You know what I mean?
Yet, in fact, that is not what results from it.
Right.
And to connect the dots is a long discussion. I know we're planning on talking for about 45 minutes.
Okay.
And the issue that you just brought up that's easily a 1-hour talk.
Okay. Well, maybe we can have another conversation then.
Or you can just read my article online, What is Equanimity? Which
we will link to that.
Yeah. I'll give you a bunch of good links, because most of the questions that you're asking they can be answered in a soundbite, but that really is deceptive, because the real, it's like science. Mm-hmm. The real answers are much deeper and more complex. But just not to get too distracted into the details, there is definitely a reason why the effect is not one of across the board cooling out and mellowing out. The effect is when you want to be cooled out and mellowed out, you can. And when you want to fully be involved in life, you can. And both of those are flavors of liberation. There's a liberation, there's a kind of no self, or let's just put it this way, there's a kind of freedom from self that comes about when self does not arise. And then there's another flavor of freedom from self that comes about when self does arise, but it's experienced with so much concentration, clarity, and equanimity that it arises as a wave, not a thing. And it is just a dynamic and vital activity called the beauty of your human personality. So you might say that that cool out, mellow out part is exactly half of the effect. Mm-hmm. The other half of the effect is this full manifestation aspect. So to use a somewhat poetic language, we could say that enlightenment, we could say that the average person is sort of half alive and half dead, and they call that alive. A successful meditator is fully alive and fully dead at the same time.
Dead in a good sense, I guess.
Yeah, fully alive and fully dead. Certainly not physically dead, but it's paradoxical. But the ability to just drop into absolute rest. And then the ability...
Did you actually do that just then?
Well, what do you think?
I don't know. Maybe you were faking, but I guess you weren't.
Well, that's true. Could be faking. One can fake.
Mm-hmm.
But to arise from that as fully vital, and to have no preference between life and death, to find them both equally fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
Using here life and death sort of as a yang and yin, metaphorically speaking. There are there's two sides to it. There's the side that is the non-arising of self.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the side that is the unblocked, fully mindful arising of self.
Mm-hmm.
So now, actually, that segues into the next effect.
Number 3.
Number 3 is to know yourself at the deepest level. Actually, meditation tends to help you know yourself at all levels, including the surface personal level. But the most interesting aspect is when you start to know yourself at deeper transpersonal levels. So everyone, let's just put it this way. The body is happy in a deep way when it knows how to derive maximum fulfillment from pleasure, and it knows how to experience pain as an empowerment rather than a suffering. Then your body is happy. Your mind superficially is happy when it has answers to this or that. You know, what am I going to make for dinner? Should I stay in this relationship or not? How can I make more money? What's the meaning of life? Why does the chicken cross the road? Okay. There could be lots of questions. And the mind is happy when it has, superficially happy when it has answers to this or that question as they come up. Because that's its surface job. The surface job of the mind is to figure out the answers to different questions that come up for us. The deep job of the mind is to understand what it is. And the mind is deeply happy when it finally answers this question: what am I?
Of course, one version of the Buddhist answer to that is I don't exist, right? The self does not exist.
There are many, many verbal answers to that question. However, there is, as far as I can see, only one experiential answer to that question. And if you have the experiential answer to that question, you are absolutely allowed to verbalize it any way you want. If you don't have the experiential answer to that question, you're also allowed to answer it any way you want, but you, how can I say, it's like...
you still don't really know.
Yeah, it's like, someone that's never made love can pontificate about sex, but, they might have something interesting to say.
Well, how do you articulate your experiential knowledge of yourself?
Sure. So let me just say that there's a wide range, and it can be very confusing. Essentially, half of the adepts of the world formulate it in terms of realizing there truly is no self. Mm-hmm. And the other half tend to formulate it in terms of realizing that there is a true witness self. Okay? So now this sounds completely contradictory on the surface. But if they were actually talking about different things, then there would be two completely different kinds of enlightenment. And that doesn't seem to be the way it works in my experience. So if you ask me how I would formulate it, well, I would say it has changed over the years. You probably know the story of the blind men and the elephant.
Yes.
Are you aware that that comes from India and is actually a Buddhist story?
I hadn't thought of it as Buddhist. No. It's
of Indic origin. The idea being that the elephant symbolizes enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And there are many different sides to that enlightenment. If you want to emphasize one, you say, well, the elephant is like a post, or the elephant is like a wall, or like a rope, or like a hose, okay, or like a big sharp tooth, because that's the side of the elephant that you're talking about. It is virtually impossible in human language to actually say something that covers the whole elephant at once. So inevitably, people who have had these experiences will emphasize one side or another. So early Buddhism, the historical Buddha, absolutely emphasized the side of enlightenment called freedom from suffering. That was his central message. However, later Buddhist schools, for example, Zen, which has some Taoist influence, might talk about that, but they might more emphasize oneness with all of creation, okay? Other teachers emphasize the dynamic side of enlightenment, how emptiness breaks apart into expansion and contraction, and how they mold the self and the world, consciousness moment by moment. So there are many, many sides. So I would say, to just get very personal for myself, in the earliest phases, it was formulated as a oneness experience for me. And then other paradigms arose as the years went on. It's not that it was a different experience, but just, now I'm looking at this side, now I'm looking at that side.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of view, the experience of you mean oneness with everything, kind of?
There's in this particular case, yes.
And you can view that as a version, certainly closely related to the no-self doctrine, in the sense that it's a feeling of the breakdown of the boundaries between you and everything, right? I mean, it's not so much like you disappearing, but it's the boundaries between you and the rest of the universe feeling much more porous and less. Is that right?
Well said.
And I mean, it's interesting the thing you said. You know, sometimes you hear, okay, the self doesn't exist. Sometimes you hear, no, it's more of a sense that there is a witness self. I think in the for most people in the early stages of practice for me, I have not gotten far at all. I have not gotten anywhere near stream entry or anything else. But one of the first, at a meditation retreat, it's very much a sense of there's still a me, but it's empowered by virtue of being less enslaved by all the different feelings and things. It's a me that's more in control and less controlled. And don't you think that's a common early experience?
Absolutely. That's usually something along those lines is the most common initial report of success with practice. So,
and that would be fine. That would be fine if I could get there on a regular basis.
Yeah,
I'm done.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's number 3. Know yourself at a deeper level.
At all levels, including the deepest level.
Okay.
At deepest level, then changes your perception of self.
Okay.
You can talk about it as oneness or emptiness or the dynamic void. Lots of ways. So effect number 4 is improvements in objective behavior. So everything we've just talked about so far is sort of the mind and body getting happy at the deepest level. Body is happy because it experiences pleasure in a more fulfilling way, experiences pain in an empowering way. Mind is happy because it's got the answer. that it's been seeking, the answer to the question, who am I, what am I? So that's all, in a sense, mind-body happiness, sensory happiness. But human beings are not just a sensory system. Human beings have an output also. There's what we say. There's what we do. There's how we carry ourselves in the world. There's how we relate to other human beings, and more broadly, how we relate to creation, how we relate to substances, food, intoxicants. There are behavioral challenges, big and small, for every human being. Mm-hmm. Things doing that we would like to do less of, things that we're not doing that we would like to do more of, okay? All of us have these issues. And I think a common notion about meditation is that it's just about getting sensory happiness, okay? The things I mentioned, less suffering, more fulfillment, enlightenment, insight, okay? Mm-hmm. But I think I think any meditative path that does not entail positive behavior change is limited in scope. So now positive behavior in the objective world is called shila in Sanskrit, sila in Pali. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's translated as precepts, but the precepts are just guidelines. Shila means character. It's a much broader concept. It's how you carry yourself in the world. Mm-hmm. And positive changes in character should be part of any complete meditative path, mm-hmm. say. And so and we could talk for hours about that.
Right, but
I've talked for hours about that.
But one thing I think you can say is that, and I think this is a little distinctive to Buddhism, is that although, becoming, what we would commonly call a better person, right? I mean, in terms of your objective behavior, what we would, most people would say you're becoming more ethical or more moral or more considerate of other people or whatever. Although there is, in Buddhist doctrine, an explicit focus on that, things you should do and things you shouldn't do. It's also true that to some extent, the kind of, good behavior grows organically out of the practice that you initially begin just to help yourself, that you may initially begin just to help yourself, right? I mean, if you're successful in ending suffering and so on and immersing yourself in the practice, a certain amount of what we would call good behavior toward others kind of flows from that, right?
I would say, as a general statistical tendency, yes, mm-hmm. That's true. However, unfortunately, it is not 100% guaranteed.
Right.
And that's why the issue of behavior is more complex. Mm-hmm. So, like I say, we don't have a whole lot of time, but I have a sort of standard formulation of how I think about this aspect of things. And, it's all on the internet. If people are interested, they can look that up. Let's go to number 5, which is not unrelated to number 4. It's a spontaneous spirit of love and service towards others. So far, everything we've talked about, it's about one person. Even the behavioral aspect is really my behaviors. But broadly, and you somewhat alluded to this, there's a strong tendency, if you're successful with the reduction of suffering, the elevation of fulfillment, and the knowing yourself deeply, that gives a strong tendency to see the whole world as yourself. Mm-hmm. No, I should say more accurately, you will see the whole world as yourself. And that's going to create a tendency to want to be of service in some way to others. So there's an outreach. This is also an ideal in the Christian tradition. Christians have meditation traditionally. It's called contemplation. And, for example, the Dominican order, Thomas Aquinas belonged to the Dominicans. Their motto is, translated in modern English, meditate and give to others the fruits of meditation. So that giving to others the fruits of meditation. In Buddhism, we call it bodhicitta, B-O-D-H-I-C-I-T-T-A. I think when meditation works, there will be an increase in this sense of service. Now, the particular form that the service takes, that varies individual to individual, culture to culture. So I would say those are the 5 main areas of impact in terms of how can we break down the general impact. The general impact is you're going to be happier, and you're going to be happier in all dimensions of happiness. So the next question to ask, or the next, so the answer why meditate is to be happier in all dimensions of happiness. The next question is, well, what do you mean by the dimensions of happiness? Reduce suffering, elevate fulfillment, understand yourself at all levels, including the deepest, make positive behavior changes for yourself, and abide in a spontaneous sense of love and service towards the world.
Okay. Now, we alluded to the fact that you've set out to kind of fuse, in a certain sense, Eastern and Western thought. And I know we can't get too deeply into that. You've developed kind of a whole system. But can you give us a sense, maybe an example of that, or maybe some overarching description of what you're up to or something?
Well, so I was born in the U.S., and I got interested in Asian culture by seeing Japanese samurai movies when I was a teenager in L.A. Now, I'm 69 years old, and so that was a long time ago. I remember Eisenhower being the president of the United States. I was born during World War II. So when I was a little boy in Los Angeles, to be interested in Asian culture was not cool. It was weird.
Right. In fact, Japanese people had been locked up.
I was specifically interested in Japan.
Yeah.
And I mean, the World War II had just ended. I mean, not that long ago. They were the enemy, and it was not a cool thing at all. But my best friend in what was then called junior high and is now called middle school was a third-generation Japanese American. Just happened. And through that, I got in contact with that culture, and I started to go with his family to see samurai movies. And then we would go to J-Town, Little Tokyo, in downtown L.A., and we go and eat Japanese food. And we do that like on a regular basis every Friday. And it was this huge adventure because there were no non-Asians there. It was not cool. It was not like, it was way before martial arts. You can go to any city of the United States and any Asian martial art, you can find a dojo, right? My friend and I searched LA. We knew that the really intense martial art was karate. We searched LA. We could not find a single place that would teach karate. Not a single one. You go into any 7-Eleven and you can get sushi, okay, now, okay. They used to laugh at me for eating sushi when I was in Venice High School. It's like, what kind of weird kid eats cold raw fish on cold rice? What's wrong with you? Okay. So this is like way back there when I was just like totally out there with my interests. And basically, I started to go to Japanese ethnic school in addition to American public school. So I was privileged to grow up bilingual and bicultural without leaving the United States. So by the time I was out of high school, I could speak, read, and write Japanese. And I was on a trajectory of sort of becoming a light-skinned Japanese person. That's what I wanted to do. I just wanted to become Japanese. Maybe some kids in Japan want to be Americans. I wanted to be Japanese. So I went to Japan, and, well, if you want to live life like you're in a period piece movie, the only place you can actually do that now in Japan is in a Buddhist temple. Mm-hmm. You go to a Buddhist temple, you might as well be living in a period piece movie, right? So that's what I did. Except, of course, I got turned around, because the purpose of being in a Japanese temple is not to be to have some cool cultural experience. The purpose is to fundamentally change as a human being, mm-hmm. which was very quickly made evident to me.
They said you don't stick around here in a casual way. You either immerse yourself or you leave.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
you immersed yourself.
So I immersed myself, uh-huh. and I went over there, and I was going to spend a year in the temple and come back and get a PhD in Buddhist studies based on that research. And I was going to be an academician. But instead I spent 3 years, took a leave of absence from my graduate program in Buddhist studies, and never went back to Buddhist academics. Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm very happy that I have that solid foundation but in academic training, but my interest shifted to experience. How can I write something deep about Buddhism if I haven't experienced at least a little bit of the Buddhist tradition? Mm-hmm. I mean, the Buddhist meditation tradition. So I got involved in practice. And then it was time to leave Japan and come back to the Western world. And I thought to myself, I've really changed. I'm standing, the image that came to me is I'm standing on top of a mountain. And that mountain is called Asian culture. And I have ascended to the top of that mountain by learning Buddhist meditation practice. This is the best that Asia has to offer. I mean, all cultures have art, all cultures have philosophy, all cultures have culture. But what was done best in Asia is this internal science of cultivating consciousness, mm-hmm. that we call broadly meditation. So I'm standing at the pinnacle of their culture, which I now am beginning to internalize. And I realized that I had no interest now whatsoever in becoming any more Japanese than I already was. I just totally lost interest in that. It's like, those are the specifics of a culture. But there's something here that is universal and done better than any other culture ever did. I came to understand that meditation exists outside of Buddhism and outside of Asia. It's in Judaism, which is what my family of origin is. It's in Christianity. It's in Islam. It's implicit in shamanic practices. It's everywhere. Mm-hmm. But in terms of a sophisticated and systematic way of going about it, you can't top Buddhism. So I'm standing at the top of this mountain. I'm standing at the pinnacle of what Asia has achieved. And I'm at the top of the mountain. There's no place to go beyond this other than to look out and say, do I see another peak that impresses me in a comparable way? And I only saw one, and it was Western science. Mm-hmm. So a natural thought occurs. Well, what if there were some way that the best of the East and the best of the West could cross-fertilize? What might happen? What might be born out of that? Maybe something that could fundamentally change the course of human history.
Mm-hmm. And you don't just mean the scientific study of meditation, right? Or do you mean to include that as well as other things? The study of the brain and the study of what's going on with meditation and all that. There's that. And is that part of what you mean, but not all of what you mean? Or?
Very good question. There's two sides to this. I should say that I had these thoughts in the early 70s.
You were ahead of your time.
Well, there were other people having those thoughts, but I didn't know them. But what I then thought is, okay, if you're gonna, it's like go big or go home, okay? If you're gonna go big, what's the biggest thing that I could possibly think of doing? The biggest thing that I could possibly think of doing was having some role in fundamentally changing the course of human history for the better. And the best shot that I have at that is this remote possibility that the best of the East and the best of the West could mate and come up with something that was inconceivably powerful. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a remote possibility. It was much more remote in those days, okay? It was very remote, but how important a piece of research is measured by what's your probability of success and what will be the implications of success. Even if the probability of success is rather small, 1 or 2% probability of success, if the consequence of success would be heaven on earth,
right.
Whew, okay, well, do the math.
Economists call that expected return, the percentage of the chances of it happening times the outcome if it happens.
Cool, I've got to write that down.
It's called expected return.
How do you know that? Do you have an economist background?
Well, I've taken economics courses. It's probability times payoff in the event that it happens.
Yeah, I got to write that down.
Okay.
If I don't write things down,
yeah.
Well, it's actually statistically, now that you mention it, it's a specific instance of expected value.
Yeah.
But I hadn't heard the term expected return.
And what that means is that if you do it often enough, if you make this bet so many times that the laws of probability, kind of have their way, then you can basically predict what the outcome will be in the end. If you do it only once, if you do the anyway, but yeah. So I totally see what you're saying. If your chance of saving the world is much above zero, and you have a plan, even though the chances are you fail, if the chances of failing are 98%, but we're talking about saving the world, I would say go for it.
This is valuable research.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, on the spec that this direction might evolve, I knew I was going to just spend my whole life meditating. That's what I wanted to do at that point. Mm-hmm. But I still have habit patterns of an academic. Previously, those had been directed towards Buddhist studies, learning Buddhist languages, which I have a familiarity, at least some familiarity with many of them. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, I still have intellectual interests, but I think I'll direct them towards math and science. On the spec that someday, if it should come to pass that these two worlds do start to get together, I'll be ideally positioned as a professional meditator and an amateur scientist mm-hmm. to facilitate the matchmaking, process, so to speak. And that turned out to be a very perspicacious idea. It was like, turned out that, in fact, the culture has evolved in that direction mm-hmm. over these decades, primarily because of an organization called the Mind and Life Institute, which got the Dalai Lama together with the Nobel scientists, et cetera, has produced Sizzle, which then produced money, which then produced
Enlightenment, I guess, would be the next thing, right? No, there's some other links in the chain. Go ahead.
Well,
sorry.
what that produced was research that showed that this stuff really works. Scientific research from credible institutions, which then makes more sizzle and brings in more money for more research. And I think what we're going to see here is a kind of Moore's law, which is an exponential growth, because the more we are able to get good science with this, then the more people have experience. Then the more they have experience, the more they fund the science. And it just spirals up. So it turned out that I was sort of right, and now I'm ideally positioned to participate in this very exciting cutting edge of human history. So you said, what form does it take? It takes two forms. The first is using science to try to understand what happens in successful meditation, understand it from a different perspective. We meditation teachers understand it from the inside, but once you try to understand it from the outside, you start to get new important insights into how things work.
So, for example, these brain scan studies that study what happens in the brain during meditation, you mean?
That kind of thing, yes. That would be an example. And then, so that's one area of the dialogue. The other area of the dialogue is, well, some of the philosophy that comes out of meditative experience sounds a lot like some of the things that come out of science. And I don't just mean the cutting edge quantum physics and that kind of thing. Even old-fashioned steam age science of the 19th century, concepts like entropy and so forth, they seem to have reflections in some of the philosophical statements of meditation adepts. So the question is this just a coincidence? Is it just a cherry picking of evidence? I mean, you can see the Virgin Mary in the Danish if you want, okay? This is well known.
Right.
So it's very easy to project onto the statements of meditators things that seem to parallel mathematics and physics and so on. However, so we have to be honest. At this point, we don't know whether those parallels are just an optical illusion or whether they point to a deeper convergence, that somehow if you apply similar principles to the inner world and the outer world, the fact that you get similar sounding paradigms isn't a coincidence, okay? That we don't know if that's true.
Right.
But it's possible that that is true, in which case there's the possibility of a kind of grand theory of everything, which links spirituality and science in terms of a world paradigm. Now that we're not there, okay? I mean, no way, Jose, are we remotely there. I don't care what the bleep movies try to say about that. We as human beings may at some time in the future understand that there's a natural convergence and we're looking at the same reality, or that might not turn out to be the case. However, what I find most exciting is the first piece that I mentioned, the applying of science to understanding what happens in successful meditation, and specifically what happens in classical enlightenment. Because if we can essentially, the best, as far as I'm concerned, the best model that we have, the clearest description, is 2,500 years old. That's the Buddha, okay? Right. If we think of the Buddha as a religious figure, that's one thing. I don't think of him that way. I think of him as a scientist. a scientist of human happiness in all of the dimensions of human happiness. Mm-hmm. He came up with a formulation that is the deepest and broadest for human happiness that we humans have come up with.
And that involved a kind of theory of mind. I mean, he was to some extent a psychologist, not an experimental psychologist, but an introspective psychologist. I mean, philosophers would say a phenomenologist, I guess. I mean, he worked hard to describe the dynamics of the mind as apprehended through introspection. And that amounts to a kind of a theory about, for example, the relationship between cognition and affect. You know, there are those dimensions. It's a kind of a theory of mind that to some extent can be tested from the standpoint of modern psychology, right?
It can be tested psychologically, but what we're aiming at is to test it from the viewpoint of biophysics. And once we can get it linked to biophysics, then the entire power of the scientific establishment is now behind the endeavor of enlightenment.
And by biophysics, you mean to include neuroscience, including these brain scans? So in other words, you mean...
I mean the purely physical variables of
that dimension. I mean, you could view that as a dimension of psychology. I mean, psychologists draw on brain scans and stuff, but I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah. It would be mathematical and biological psychology. Mm-hmm. So if we can get this, if we can understand classical enlightenment in terms of purely physical units, mass, length, time, thermodynamic temperature, electrical current, amount of substance, etc., etc. Now what happens is that the two things. The power of science is now harnessed towards making no, that's not the way I wanted to say it. The power of science can then, in theory, be harnessed towards democratizing enlightenment, making it widely available. Right now, it takes an awful long time, and it's rather slow. Mm-hmm. Of course, from my way of thinking, what else are you going to do? Okay, what's the alternative to meditate? The alternative to meditating is not meditating, meaning that your happiness is dependent on the vagaries of chance. I don't want my happiness to be dependent on the vagaries of chance. So, therefore, I'm willing to put in the hours and decades of practice. But the average person doesn't get a reward quickly enough to make a commitment to put in those hours and decades of practice. Mm-hmm. If we can accelerate the process so that what typically takes 20 years or 30 years might take 2 years or 3 years, then there should be a viral spread of enlightenment over the planet. Now, by accelerate, as soon as I start to mention that, people have weird ideas about what I might be talking about, like an enlightenment pill or something like that. I have no idea what form it will take, and no one knows. But I would suspect that it would be some combination of some formal meditation practice, some learning of concepts, and then some sort of techno boosts that accelerate the formal practice.
Like feedback technologies, or
it could be in the form of some kind of extremely sophisticated biofeedback. It could be in the form of some non-invasive types of stimulators. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I get a sense for that. So we have talked for more than about an hour, I guess, which is about as long as we ever go. I have like a million other things I could ask you, and I'm sure the viewers do. Some of these questions they can answer by going to the things that we link to. So I hope you'll send us some links.
I will send you a whole resource goodie package.
And then beyond that, maybe down the road, if your calendar opens up again, we can carry the conversation further, because this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too. I've totally enjoyed it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time, Shinzen.
Very good.
Okay, bye-bye.